The number that changed my life. $1.4 million. That's what it cost to build the place where I'm writing this. Less than a townhouse in Arlington. Less than a yacht that would capsize in its first real storm. More than everything my grandmother left me combined with 6 years of 12-hour days at a vertical farming startup in Richmond where I taught automated systems to grow lettuce in shipping containers while the CEO practiced his TED Talk in the break room. The money moved from my account to a construction contractor on a Thursday afternoon in October, and the Wells Fargo branch manager who processed the wire transfer clicked his pen against the marble countertop 11 times while the system verified the amount. I counted. I count things when I'm spending everything I have. His office smelled like leather and carpet adhesive and the recycled air of a building whose climate control system I understood better than he did. The mechanical hum of the HVAC overhead was the last climate-controlled air I would take for granted. My name is Connor Voss. I'm 34 years old. I was a controlled environment agriculture engineer, which is a title that means I designed and operated systems that grow food without sunlight, soil, or seasons. Nutrient film technique hydroponics, deep water culture, aeroponics, LED spectrum optimization for photosynthetic active radiation between 400 and 700 nanometers. I understood how plants eat, how they drink, how they breathe in enclosed spaces where every variable is measured and every output is calculated. I spent 3 years at Aero Farms in Newark before moving to a Series B startup called Green Axis in Richmond that was trying to build modular vertical farms for military forward operating bases. The military contracts never materialized. The startup ran through its funding in 20 months. I kept the knowledge. Nobody at Green Axis understood why I bought 5 acres in Albemarle County, Virginia, 40 minutes southwest of Charlottesville, on a ridge overlooking the Hardware Valley with sight lines in 3 directions and a natural spring that produced 11 gallons per minute year-round. They thought I wanted privacy. I wanted water, elevation, and a specific type of Virginia red clay that compacts to near concrete density when properly graded, which makes it ideal for underground construction. I had been designing the greenhouse in my head for 4 years before I broke ground. Every pipe diameter, every nutrient reservoir volume, every watt of lighting calculated against caloric output per square foot per growth cycle. The math lived in a notebook I carried in my work bag beside my laptop. Nobody ever asked what was in it. Nobody ever asked why I spent my lunch breaks reading FEMA continuity of operations manuals and agricultural extension papers on root vegetable caloric density. They call me paranoid. My colleagues at Green Axis use the word casually, the way people use it when they mean eccentric but want to sound concerned. Connor's paranoid phase, they said, like it was a dietary preference or a hobby I'd outgrow. My sister Maya told me I was processing Grandma's death by converting grief into concrete. My ex-wife told me I was building a bunker instead of building a marriage. She wasn't wrong about the second part. I was spending every weekend driving to a property in the mountains and pouring money into a hole in the ground while she ate dinner alone in our apartment in Richmond. The divorce papers arrived the same month the concrete cured. I signed them at the kitchen table and drove to the property the same afternoon. The thing about being called paranoid is that the word only works in one direction. If nothing happens, you're the cautionary tale about obsession. If something happens, you're the only person in the room who prepared. There is no version of paranoia that gets validated in real time. It either looks foolish forever or it looks prescient after it's too late for anyone else to catch up. I didn't build the greenhouse because I knew what was coming. I built it because I understood growth curves, resource depletion models, and the mathematics of fragile supply chains. I understood that the distance between civilization and starvation is exactly 3 missed harvests. And I understood that nobody was building a backup. The banker approved the transfer. His pen stopped clicking. The money disappeared into a contractor's account and reappeared as a hole in Virginia clay 30 feet deep and 60 feet wide. Everything I owned went into that hole. Everything I came out of it. 30 feet down. The excavation took 9 days. A Caterpillar 320 hydraulic excavator operated by a man named Dale, who charged me $400 a day and asked no questions about why someone was digging a rectangular pit 30 feet deep into a Virginia hillside with no visible foundation plan and no building permits posted. Dale had operated heavy equipment for 26 years. He read the soil the way I read nutrient solution, by feel, by color, by the resistance it offered to the machinery. On the third day, he shut down the engine, climbed out of the cab, and knelt at the edge of the pit. He picked up a handful of the red clay we'd excavated and squeezed it in his fist. When he opened his hand, it held its shape perfectly. Didn't crumble. Didn't crack. You could pour foundation against this without forms, he said. This clay will hold anything you put next to it. I know, I said. That's why I bought the property. He looked at me for a long time. Then he climbed back into the excavator and kept digging. The diesel growl of the caterpillar became the soundtrack of that October, rattling through the trees from dawn until the light failed, shaking loose the last of the season's leaves. The pit grew deeper. The clay walls rose around it like the interior of something organic, a throat swallowing downward into the earth. The concrete came from a batch plant in Waynesboro. 47 cubic yards of 6,000 psi reinforced mix poured over 3 days into forms I'd built with Marcus, my property's handyman, who had helped me clear the land the previous spring and who possessed the rare quality of understanding work without requiring explanation. Marcus held rebar in place while I wired connections. We worked in silence, broken only by the wet percussion of concrete flowing from the truck's chute into forms that would become walls, floor, ceiling. 12 inches thick on all sides. Blast rated by accident of specification because I hadn't designed for explosions. I designed for permanence. For the weight of 30 feet of earth pressing inward from every direction for decades without compromise. The concrete cured for 28 days. I visited every third day to check moisture levels, running my palm across the surface the way you'd check a patient's forehead. Cool, dense, slightly chalky under the fingertips with a mineral smell that reminded me of my grandmother's basement in Roanoke, where she kept canned tomatoes on wooden shelves and told me that people who grow their own food never truly go hungry. She said this in 1998. I was 6. I didn't understand it as philosophy. I understood it as fact, the way children understand gravity. Things fall. People who grow food eat. The money she left me when she died in 2022 was $410,000. She had no idea what I'd build with it. She would have understood why. While the concrete cured, my marriage ended. Rachel left on a Wednesday. She'd packed while I was at the property checking pour moisture, and she was gone by the time I returned to the apartment. No argument, no confrontation. A note on the kitchen counter beside her keys. I read it standing in the doorway, still wearing boots caked with Virginia clay, and the words were careful and precise and completely accurate. She wrote that she couldn't compete with a hole in the ground for my attention, and that she hoped whatever I was building would be worth what I was losing. The divorce papers arrived 11 days later. I signed them at the same counter where her note had been. The pen worked on the first try. I drove to the property afterward and stood at the edge of the pit looking down at cured concrete that would outlast everything I'd failed to maintain above ground. The greenhouse systems arrived in December. 14 pallets delivered by a freight carrier to the gravel pullout at the base of my access road. Crop King NFT hydroponic channels, 200 feet of food-grade PVC. 12 Cree X-Lamp LED grow light arrays rated at 4 kilowatts each, totaling 48 kilowatts of full-spectrum photosynthetically active radiation. A nutrient mixing station with automated pH and EC dosing. A closed-loop dehumidification system that captured transpired moisture and recycled it back into the reservoir at 93% efficiency. I carried every pallet down the stairs myself. It took 2 days. My shoulders bled where the straps cut through my shirt. The first seed went into a rockwool cube on January 14th, a butterhead lettuce variety called Rex. I placed it under the LEDs, adjusted the spectrum to 18 hours of blue-dominant light for vegetative growth, and watched. It sprouted in 4 days. 30 feet underground, in a concrete room that smelled like wet mineral and possibility, a plant grew because I told it to. The first harvest nobody saw. The Rex lettuce reached harvest weight in 31 days. I cut at the base with a clean blade, held it under the LED array, and examined the roots. White, dense, branching through the rock wool with the aggressive reach of a plant that had never experienced drought, wind, pest pressure, or the unpredictability of actual weather. It was, by every measurable metric, a perfect head of lettuce. Grown 30 feet underground in January in Virginia in a concrete room that sunlight had never touched. I ate it standing at the nutrient mixing station with no dressing, no plate, no ceremony. It tasted like water and chlorophyll and proof. Over the next 14 months, I tested everything the system could produce. Butterhead and romaine lettuce in the NFT channels, cycling every 28 to 35 days. Cherry tomatoes and bell peppers in the deep water culture beds, fruiting under a red dominant light spectrum shifted to 12 hours to simulate summer photo period. Basil, cilantro, dill, and mint in a vertical aeroponic tower that Dr. Patel would later call the most efficient use of cubic footage he'd ever seen. Sweet potatoes and regular potatoes in modified grow bags filled with a perlite vermiculite blend, which I knew from my AeroFarms research could produce viable tubers under artificial light if the spectrum included sufficient far-red wavelengths to trigger tuberization. I kept a spreadsheet. Every crop, every cycle, every gram of yield measured against the nutrient input, water consumption, and kilowatt hours of light required to produce it. The math converged around a number I checked 3 times because I didn't trust it the first 2. 20 to 100 calories per person per day. Sustainably, indefinitely, for up to 8 people. The greenhouse could feed 8 human beings without sunlight, without soil, without rain, without a single input from the outside world except electricity and the trace minerals I'd stockpiled in 50-pound bags from a hydroponic supply warehouse in Fredericksburg. Electricity was the vulnerability. Every system in the greenhouse depended on it. The LED arrays drew 48 kilowatts at peak. The water pumps, climate control, dehumidification, and nutrient dosing added another 12. 60 kilowatts of continuous demand required a power source that couldn't fail, couldn't be interrupted, couldn't depend on a grid managed by people who might not exist in 6 months. I installed a 40-kilowatt solar array on the south-facing slope above the greenhouse entrance, angled at 34 degrees to optimize for Albemarle County's latitude. 2 Tesla Powerwall units provided 27 kilowatt-hours of battery storage, enough to bridge overnight gaps and cloudy periods of up to 3 days. Behind those, a 22-kilowatt Generac propane generator connected to a buried 1,000-gallon tank that I'd calculated would provide 45 days of continuous backup at 50% load. 3 layers of redundancy. Solar is primary, battery is buffer, propane is the last resort that bought me 6 weeks to solve whatever had gone wrong. My neighbor Gary saw the solar panels going up and walked over with a beer in his hand and a grin that suggested he'd already formed his theory. "That's a lot of panels for a single guy living alone," he said. "You running a grow operation down there, Connor?" I told him I was experimenting with indoor agriculture. He laughed and said, "Sure, agriculture," and winked. He told his wife, who told the other neighbors, and by spring the quiet consensus on Ridgeline Road was that the quiet divorced man in the last house on the left was growing marijuana in an underground facility, and that it explained both the construction noise and the electricity bills. Nobody called the police. Nobody was concerned. It was Albemarle County. People minded their business and let eccentrics be eccentric. The first tomato ripened on March 9th under purple-white LED light that made its red skin look almost black. I picked it and held it in my palm, and it was warm from the lamps, which struck me as the strangest detail. Warmth from artificial light in an underground room. I bit into it, and the flavor was sharper and sweeter than any greenhouse tomato I'd grown at AeroFarms. As if the plant, deprived of every natural stimulus, had concentrated everything it had into the fruit. Like it was trying harder than any plant grown in open air had ever needed to. The systems worked. The food grew. The only variable I hadn't tested was whether the world above would ever need what I'd built below. The arithmetic of collapse. The news out of Norfolk started on a Wednesday. I was eating dinner alone at the kitchen table above the greenhouse, a bowl of rice and peppers I'd grown myself, when CNN interrupted a segment about housing prices with a breaking banner that read localized contamination event, Norfolk Naval Station. Multiple casualties reported. The anchor used the word localized 4 times in 90 seconds. She used the word contained twice. She did not use the word spreading, which told me more than everything she did say. I work with biological systems. I've spent my entire professional life watching organisms multiply in controlled environments, measuring doubling times, tracking exponential curves on graphs that always look flat at the beginning and vertical at the end. The distance between flat and vertical is where most people lose comprehension. They see the flat part and assume we'll stay flat. They cannot intuit what doubling means because human brains evolved to think in straight lines, not curves. A population that doubles every 31 hours goes from 100 to 1,000 in 10 days. From 1,000 to 1 million in 20. The math doesn't negotiate. I pulled a napkin from the holder on the table and wrote numbers on it with a pen that bled through the thin paper. The napkin tore at the edges where the ink pooled. I wrote Norfolk's reported case count as of the broadcast, 47 confirmed. I assumed a doubling period between 24 and 48 hours based on the density of a naval installation and the fact that containment language was already failing. I ran the curve forward. At 31 hours per doubling, which split the difference conservatively, 47 cases became 94 in a day and a half, became 188 by Friday, became 752 by Sunday. By the following Wednesday, the number exceeded 6,000. By the Wednesday after that, it exceeded 48,000, and by then it wouldn't matter what the news called it, because 48,000 infected people couldn't be localized anywhere. They become geography. I set the napkin on the table and looked at it the way I'd once looked at yield projections that told me a crop cycle was going to fail. The numbers don't lie. They also don't comfort. They just describe what's coming and let you decide how long you want to sit with the description before you act. I acted that night. The final preparation checklist existed in the same notebook I'd carried at Green Axis, handwritten across 6 pages in a shorthand only I could read. I'd written it 18 months ago during the testing phase when the greenhouse was proving itself, and the question shifted from, can this work, to what else do I need when it has to? The checklist was organized by category, and I began working through it with the systematic focus of a man who'd been rehearsing this in his head for longer than he was comfortable admitting. Medical supplies. I had a base kit assembled by Ruth, my neighbor and retired veterinarian, who'd helped me with soil biology during the testing phase and who kept a professional-grade trauma kit in her own home out of professional habit. I needed to supplement it with prescription antibiotics, which I'd been stockpiling through a veterinary supply catalog that sold amoxicillin and doxycycline in bulk without asking whether the patient had 4 legs or 2. Water filtration redundancy. The greenhouse's dehumidification system recycled 93% of transpired moisture, but the input reservoir depended on the natural spring at the property's north edge. I needed a secondary filtration path in case the spring became inaccessible or contaminated. I had 2 Sawyer .1 filters rated for 100,000 gallons each, stored in the greenhouse's utility closet. Seed stock rotation. The current inventory covered 8 crop varieties with enough seed for approximately 36 growth cycles. Sufficient for 3 years. I wanted 5. I made a note to call Dr. Patel. Ammunition. I owned a Remington 870 12 gauge and a Ruger 10 22 rifle. I had 200 shells for the shotgun and 500 rounds of 22 long rifle. I didn't know if that was enough. I didn't know enough about what was coming to calculate what enough meant. The napkin was still on the table. The ink had dried. The numbers hadn't changed. I picked up my phone and started making calls. The list of 7. The list had existed for over a year. 6 names written on the inside cover of my notebook in pencil, because pencil can be erased and names can be reconsidered when the calculus of survival shifts. I'd revised it 3 times. The first version had 9 names. The second had 4. The final version had 6, chosen not by affection alone, but by a formula I never spoke aloud, because speaking it would have made me the person my colleagues already thought I was. The formula was simple. Each person needed to meet at least one of 3 criteria: a skill set the greenhouse community required, a biological bond one couldn't sever, or a physical proximity that made retrieval possible within 48 hours. Love was not a criterion. Love was a variable I couldn't quantify and therefore couldn't plan around. Utility was the framework. I hated that. I used it anyway. I called Maya first. My sister, 31, paramedic with Henrico County Fire and Rescue, married to David, who was a licensed electrician working commercial projects in the Richmond suburbs. They had Lily, who was 9, and who called me Uncle C, and who drew pictures of plants I'd shown her in the greenhouse during her one visit the previous summer. Maya answered on the second ring. She was on a 48-hour shift rotation and sounded like she'd been sleeping in chair. I told her to pack bags for 3 people, enough for 30 days, and drive to my property by Thursday morning. I told her to bring her full trauma kit, every medication she could access, and David's electrical tools. I told her not to stop for anything between Richmond and Albemarle County and to take Route 250 west instead of I-64, because the interstate would be the first road to lock. She laughed, not a cruel laugh. The warm, affectionate, slightly exhausted laugh of a younger sister who had watched her older brother pour his entire life into a concrete room full of lettuce. "Connor," she said, "is this about Norfolk? Because the department briefed us this morning, and they said it's contained to the naval station." Everything is fine. Everything is fine is the last sentence of every civilization that didn't make it. I didn't say that. I said please. She heard something in my voice that the word carried beyond its single syllable. She stopped laughing. She said she talked to David. The coffee I'd poured before the call was cold on the counter by the time I hung up. I didn't reheat it. I called Dr. Patel. Vikram Patel had been the chief plant pathologist at Green Axis before the startup collapsed. He was 53, methodical, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of plant disease vectors that made him invaluable in a closed agricultural system where a single fungal outbreak could destroy an entire crop cycle in days. He listened to my entire pitch without interrupting. Then he was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted. "I need to think about it," he said. I told him the math. He said he'd seen the math. He said he needed to think about what he'd be leaving behind, which I understood meant his apartment in Richmond, his research library, and the particular loneliness of a widower whose professional identity had dissolved with his employer. He hung up. I let him think. Ruth Calloway answered her landline on the first ring because Ruth always answered on the first ring. She was 72, lived alone on the adjacent property, and had practiced veterinary medicine for 41 years before retiring. She'd helped me calibrate the greenhouse's nutrient concentrations and had once told me that plants and animals run on the same chemistry, just at different speeds. When I told her what I was asking, she was quiet for a moment, then said she'd bring her surgical kit and the antibiotics from her barn clinic. Marcus was already on the property replacing a fence post when I walked outside to find him. I didn't call Marcus. I just told him. He put down the post hole digger, wiped his hands on his jeans, and nodded. "When do they get here?" he asked. "Thursday," I said. "I'll have the bunks ready," he said, and went back to the fence post because it still needed replacing and Marcus didn't stop working until work was done. 6 calls. 6 lives measured against 8 billion. The mathematics of selection is the cruelest arithmetic there is. The last run. Patel arrived Thursday morning at 6:14 a.m., 11 hours after I'd given him time to think. He drove a silver Camry with a cracked windshield and parked it beside the greenhouse entrance without shutting off the engine for a full 30 seconds, as if preserving the option to reverse. When he finally turned the key, he sat in the silence for a moment before opening the door. He brought 2 suitcases, a hardshell case containing a portable microscope, and a sealed plastic crate of heirloom seed stock. 47 varieties of vegetable and grain seed that he'd been maintaining from his personal collection since his time at the USDA Germplasm Resources Information Network. The seed stock was worth more than the car. He knew that. That's why it was in the front seat and not the trunk. Marcus and I left for Charlottesville at 8 a.m. in my F-150. The Tractor Supply Company on Hydraulic Road was our last stop before sealing the greenhouse. I'd written the list on an index card in order of priority. 12 50-pound bags of perlite, 8 bags of vermiculite, 400 net pots in 2-inch and 3-inch sizes, 6 bottles of General Hydroponics pH down concentrate, 3 boxes of Apra pH testing solution, and from the veterinary aisle, 4 bottles of fish amoxicillin, 500 milligrams, 100 capsules each, which were chemically identical to human-grade antibiotics and available without a prescription to anyone willing to pretend they owned fish. The store was busier than usual for a Thursday. Not panicked, not frantic, but populated by a particular kind of shopper I recognized immediately. People buying with urgency they couldn't fully explain. A man in a Carhartt jacket was loading a generator onto a flatbed cart with the focused energy of someone who'd never bought a generator before and was working from a YouTube tutorial he'd watched in the parking lot. A woman in yoga pants had a cart filled with cases of bottled water stacked 4 high. Behind her, another woman was buying batteries, flashlights, and canned soup in quantities that suggested she was provisioning for a month or performing a competitive shopping exercise. Nobody was buying growing medium. Nobody was in the hydroponic supply aisle. Nobody in the store was preparing to produce food. They were preparing to consume what they could carry, and when that ran out, they would have nothing. The difference between stockpiling and sustainability is the difference between a candle and a power plant. One burns down, the other doesn't. I loaded the perlite bags into the truck bed. The chalky white dust coated my palms and settled into the creases of my knuckles. It felt like calcium powder, dry and mineral, the texture of something designed to hold moisture for roots that didn't exist yet but would. Marcus carried the vermiculite and stacked the bags with the architectural precision he applied to everything. He placed the pH solutions in the cab's back seat, cushioned between the amoxicillin boxes and a folded moving blanket. He didn't speak during the loading. Marcus communicated through the quality of his work, and the careful placement of those bottles said more about his understanding of what was coming than any conversation could. The drive home took 34 minutes. Route 250 West was fuller than normal. The cars moved, but with a density that suggested people were going somewhere specific rather than commuting. Everyone was heading away from something they hadn't named yet. The radio carried Norfolk updates between music that sounded obscene in context. A pop song about summer, followed by a reporter saying the word quarantine for the first time on a major network. Marcus reached over and turned the radio off. The quiet in the cab was heavy and purposeful, the silence of 2 men who knew exactly what they were driving toward and had chosen it anyway. We reached the property at 4:41 p.m. Maya and David were already there. Lily was sitting on the porch steps, drawing a picture of the solar panels in a sketchbook. Ruth was inside, organizing her surgical instruments on the kitchen table with the systematic calm of a woman who had been preparing for emergencies her entire professional life. At 9:47 p.m., I opened the greenhouse entrance for the last time as a door that went both ways. 7 people descended the concrete stairs. Marcus went last. He pulled the steel door closed behind him and engaged the manual bolts from inside. The sound of the locks engaging was low and final, a mechanical sentence with no question mark. Above us, the world went quiet. Below us, the water pumps hummed and the lettuce grew under purple light, and none of it knew what was happening on the surface. Day 1 below. The first thing 6 people said when they stepped into the greenhouse was nothing. They stood at the bottom of the concrete stairs and looked at 3,200 square feet of controlled environment agriculture operating 30 feet below the surface of Virginia, and every one of them went silent in a different way. Maya's silence was recognition. She'd visited once before, but the system had been half-built then, skeletal, theoretical. Now it was alive. 200 feet of PVC channel running the length of the main bay, green with lettuce in 6 stages of growth. Aeroponic towers rising from the floor like pillars, misting nutrient solution onto dangling roots every 12 seconds. Deep water culture beds with tomato plants floating on foam rafts, their roots submerged in oxygenated water that circulated with a sound like a slow creek running through a hospital. David's silence was mechanical. He was tracing the electrical conduit along the ceiling with his eyes, mapping the circuit layout the way he mapped commercial buildings. I watched him count junction boxes. Ruth's silence was professional. She'd already moved past the spectacle and was scanning for the medical station I'd set up in the northeast corner. Marcus's silence was familiar. He'd helped build the place. He was checking his work. Lily's silence lasted 4 seconds before she walked to the nearest tomato plant and pressed her ear against the stem. "Can it hear us?" she asked. "Can the plant hear us talking?" Nobody answered her. The question sat in the recycled air like something too fragile to touch. The LED grow lights cast everything in a purple-white wash that turned skin tones alien, made teeth look faintly blue, and rendered the green of the lettuce into a color that didn't exist in the natural world. We looked like people from a different atmosphere. In a sense, we were. I spent the first 6 hours orienting the group. The greenhouse was divided into 4 functional bays. Bay 1 held the NFT hydroponic channels, currently producing lettuce, herbs, and leafy greens on a 30-day cycle. Bay 2 contained the deep water culture beds for tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, operating on a 60 to 90-day fruiting cycle. Bay 3 was the aeroponic tower section, running strawberries, herbs, and experimental root vegetables. Bay 4 was storage, mechanical systems, and a nutrient mixing station where automated dosing pumps maintained the pH between 5.8 and 6.2 and the electrical conductivity between 1.2 and 2.0 millisiemens per centimeter, depending on the crop stage. I explained this to 6 people who had never calibrated a nutrient reservoir. Maya asked how long the food would last. I told her the greenhouse produced continuously. There was no last. The food didn't run out as long as the light stayed on and the water circulated and someone monitored the nutrient levels. She looked at me as if I'd told her the room could perform miracles. I told her it was agriculture. "Same thing," she said. The emergency food supply was separate from the greenhouse output. 90 days of freeze-dried meals, canned proteins, rice, and dried beans stored in sealed 5-gallon buckets along the west wall of Bay 4. I established a rationing protocol immediately. The emergency stores were for the 45-day gap between sealing the door and the greenhouse reaching full production capacity, with 10 mature crop cycles running simultaneously. Until then, we ate stored food supplemented by whatever the greenhouse produced in real time. Ruth cataloged the medical supplies within the first 3 hours. She commandeered a folding table in the northeast corner and arranged medications, instruments, suture kits, and the veterinary antibiotics I'd purchased in Charlottesville with a taxonomic precision that suggested she'd organized field surgical stations before. Each item was logged in a composition notebook she'd brought from her house. Date of entry, quantity, expiration, dosage range. She wrote in the small, deliberate handwriting of a woman who'd spent 4 decades keeping records that other people's lives depended on. That first night, 7 people slept in a concrete room 30 feet underground while water pumps hummed through 200 feet of PVC and LED lights cycled through their 18-hour photo period above rows of lettuce that didn't know it was night. The constant low drone of the circulation system was louder than I'd anticipated when shared with other bodies. I'd lived with the sound for months alone. It had become invisible. Now, hearing it through the awareness of 6 people trying to sleep in an unfamiliar place, it sounded like what it was. A machine keeping things alive by refusing to stop. Lily fell asleep first. She slept with her hand curled around a strawberry she'd picked from the aeroponic tower. She hadn't eaten it. She was saving it. I didn't ask for what. The signal in the soil sensors. On the 4th day, I found the anomaly. I was running my morning diagnostic on the greenhouse monitoring system, a network of 12 Raspberry Pi microcontrollers connected to capacitive soil moisture sensors, pH probes, and electrical conductivity meters distributed across all 4 bays. The system logged data every 60 seconds and displayed it on a 7-inch touchscreen mounted beside the nutrient mixing station. I checked it the way a pilot checks instruments before flight. Not because I expected a problem, because the habit of checking is what prevents the moment when a problem becomes a catastrophe. Bay 1's sensors were nominal. Bay 2, nominal. Bay 3 showed a reading I didn't understand. The EC sensor in aeroponic tower 4 was registering periodic spikes at intervals that had nothing to do with nutrient dosing cycles. The dosing pump activated every 8 hours. These spikes occurred every 47 seconds. Precisely every 47 seconds. Not approximately, not roughly. 47.0 seconds between each spike, consistent across every reading for the past 6 hours. I checked the hardware. The sensor was a standard Atlas Scientific Ease-Yo conductivity probe, accurate to within 2%. I pulled it from the tower, cleaned the electrode, recalibrated it in a reference solution, and reinstalled it. The spikes continued. Same interval, same amplitude. I moved the sensor to a different tower. The spikes followed. I disconnected the sensor entirely and held it in the open air away from any nutrient solution, any water, any conductive medium. The spikes continued. The probe wasn't measuring conductivity in my system. It was receiving something from outside it. A signal propagating through the concrete floor, through the bedrock, through 30 feet of Virginia red clay, and registering on an instrument designed to measure the electrical properties of water. Something was transmitting through the ground at a frequency my agricultural sensors could detect, but my conscious awareness could not. I called Patel to the monitoring station. He studied the data in silence for 4 minutes, scrolling through the log with his index finger, his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The green numbers reflected in his lenses, scrolling upward like a language being translated in real time. Then he asked me to pull the raw waveform data and export it to the laptop I kept in bay for record keeping. We spent 2 hours analyzing the signal's characteristics. The frequency was extremely low, in the range of 3 to 5 hertz, well below the threshold of human hearing. The periodicity was exact, 47 seconds, and the waveform wasn't random noise. It had structure, repeating packets of data embedded in what looked like a carrier wave, the same architecture used in submarine communications where signals must penetrate water, earth, and rock. Patel sat back in his chair and removed his glasses. He cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, which I'd learned was his processing gesture. The behavior he performed while his mind reorganized information into a conclusion he wasn't yet comfortable stating. The periodicity, he said finally, 47 seconds. That's significant. Why? Because the incubation reports from Norfolk, the early ones before the broadcast stopped, cited an average symptom onset of 47 hours after exposure. 47 hours. 47 seconds. The ratio is 3,600 to 1. He paused. That's not a coincidence. That's a harmonic. I stared at the waveform on the screen. The green line pulsed with metronomic patience, rising and falling at an interval that apparently matched the biological clock of the infection itself. A signal moving through the Earth's substrate at a frequency that mirrored the organism's replication cycle. The implication settled through my body like ice water pooling at the base of my spine. The infection wasn't just biological. It had an electromagnetic component. Something was broadcasting. Something underground, beneath us, around us, transmitting through the very geology I'd chosen for its structural density and stability. The same clay that held my concrete walls in place was conducting a signal I couldn't hear, but my $35 sensor could measure. I felt it then. Not the signal itself, but the awareness of it. A low vibration through the concrete floor that I'd attributed to the water pumps since the day I'd poured the foundation. It had always been there. Beneath the hum of the circulation system, beneath the click of the dosing pumps, beneath everything. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. 47 seconds. Patel wanted to study it. I could see the hunger in his posture, the forward lean of a scientist who'd found a question that justified his entire career. Behind me, I heard Ruth's wire cutters click open. The argument that split the room. Ruth stood 3 feet behind me, with the wire cutters open in her right hand, the blades positioned around the data cable that connected the Raspberry Pi sensor network to the greenhouse's main monitoring hub. She hadn't cut it yet. She was waiting for me to give her a reason not to. Cut it, she said. Whatever that signal is, it's interacting with our systems. We don't know what it does. We don't know what it carries. And we don't know if receiving it has consequences we can't see yet. She spoke with the flat authority of a veterinarian who'd spent 41 years making decisions about organisms she couldn't ask questions to. Ruth diagnosed by observation, by data, by the professional assumption that unknown variables in a biological system should be treated as threats until proven otherwise. Her wire cutters clicked open and closed in her left hand now, transferred unconsciously, a nervous rhythm disguised as preparation. Patel didn't stand up from the monitoring station. He spoke without turning around, his eyes fixed on the waveform pulsing across the screen. If we sever the sensors, we lose the only instrument capable of measuring this signal. We have no radio equipment that operates in the 3 to 5 hertz range. No antenna, no receiver. This probe is detecting something that billion-dollar military installations may have missed because they weren't looking in the right frequency domain. He turned then, and his face carried an expression I'd only seen once before, during a breakthrough at Green Axis when he'd identified a novel fungal pathogen 3 weeks before it would have destroyed an entire crop rotation. Bright, focused, reckless with certainty. This could be the mechanism, he said. The carrier wave for the infection's coordination. If we can decode the signal structure, we might understand how it propagates, how it communicates, how to interrupt it. Or it could be broadcasting something into our shelter that we can't perceive, Ruth said. Something that's been running through the floor since before we got here. Something your sensors just happened to notice because you calibrated them correctly. Congratulations on the calibration, Vikram. Now let me cut the cable. They looked at me. Everyone looked at me. Maya had come from a sleeping area when the voices carried. David stood behind her with his arms crossed, reading the room the way electricians read junction boxes, tracing the flow of energy to find where the fault line was. Marcus leaned against the doorframe of Bay 4 with his hands in his pockets, waiting. He would do whatever I decided, not because he lacked opinions, but because he understood that in a closed system, someone has to be the final circuit breaker. Lily was watching from the corridor. She held a strawberry she'd picked from Aeroponic Tower 2, the juice staining her chin and her fingers pink. She didn't understand what we were arguing about. She understood that the adults were afraid, which was worse. I looked at the waveform, 47 seconds between pulses, steady as a heartbeat, steady as something that had been beating long before we arrived and would continue long after we made our decision. Both of you are right, I said, and that's the problem. I spent the next 3 hours building a compromise that satisfied neither of them. I disconnected the sensor network from the greenhouse's main control system entirely, physically severing the data cable that Ruth had been ready to cut and isolating the Raspberry Pi units onto a standalone circuit powered by their own dedicated battery bank. The sensors could still measure. Patel could still study. But nothing they received could propagate into the systems that controlled our water, our nutrients, our light, our climate. The signal, whatever it was, could enter the sensors and stop there. A dead end. An observation post with no door to the rest of the building. Patel accepted the compromise because it preserved his ability to study. Ruth accepted it because the main systems were physically severed. Neither of them was satisfied. Satisfaction requires someone to be wrong. And in this argument, both positions were built on foundations I couldn't fault. The compromise held for 11 days. During those 11 days, Patel logged over 15,000 data points and began mapping the signal's packet structure with the methodical intensity of a man who believed he was reading the infection source code. Ruth checked the severed cable junction every morning. Every morning, it was still severed. Every morning, she looked slightly less reassured by that fact. On the 12th day, someone knocked on the steel door from above. 3 deliberate impacts, spaced evenly. Human cadence. Every head in the greenhouse turned toward the ceiling. The knocking. 3 knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. The pattern was deliberate. Measured. Human hands produce irregular rhythms under stress. These were spaced with the discipline of someone who understood that communication through a steel door requires consistency, not force. Whoever was knocking had done this before or had been trained to. I climbed the concrete stairs with the Remington 870 in my hands and my pulse in my teeth. Marcus was 2 steps behind me, carrying a crowbar. Not because a crowbar would help against what might be on the other side of that door, but because Marcus always carried the right tool for the physical problem, and the crowbar was what he had. Below us, Maya had moved Lily into Bay 4 behind the storage shelves. David stood at the base of the stairs with a hunting knife I didn't know he owned. Ruth stayed at her medical station. Patel stayed at his monitoring screen. People default to their functions under pressure. It's the most reliable thing about us. I reached the door and pressed my ear against the steel. Cold. The same cold I remembered from the day I'd first sealed it. The metal was thick enough to silence a generator. I couldn't hear breathing, movement, or the wet mechanical cadence I'd been imagining in nightmares since Norfolk. I heard nothing, which meant either no one was there or someone was standing perfectly still and waiting. I keyed the intercom I'd installed beside the door frame, a simple two-way system wired to a weatherproof speaker on the surface. "Who's out there?" The response came immediately. A woman's voice, controlled, clipped, the vocal signature of someone trained to transmit information efficiently. "3 people. Unarmed. No bites. We saw your solar array from the ridge and followed the conduit to the door. My name is Elise Marchetti. I'm a former combat medic, 68 Whiskey, U.S. Army. I have my son, age 17, and a civilian with us. We've been moving for 9 days. We need shelter." 68 Whiskey, the military occupational specialty code for a combat medic. Not information a civilian would fabricate under pressure, because it's not information a civilian would know. I looked at Marcus. He raised his eyebrows a quarter inch, which in Marcus's vocabulary was the equivalent of a 5-minute tactical assessment. The outside air hit me before I saw their faces. I cracked the door 4 inches, and the atmosphere of the surface world poured through the gap like something that had been waiting. Cold, carrying smoke from a source I couldn't identify. Pine resin. And beneath those, something organic and wrong, a sweetness that belonged in a compost pile or a wound that had gone septic. The smell of biological matter breaking down at scale. I breathed it once and closed my mouth and didn't breathe through my nose again until the door was sealed. 3 people stood on the concrete apron outside the entrance. Elise was maybe 40, short brown hair matted against her skull, wearing a military surplus jacket over civilian clothes that didn't fit. Her son Kai was 17 and tall enough that the height seemed recent, like his body hadn't finished deciding what to do with itself. He stood behind his mother with his hands visible and open, fingers spread, a gesture that might have been surrender or might have been showing me he held nothing. The third was an older man, maybe 65, heavy through the shoulders with hands that were calloused in patterns I recognized from tradesmen. He introduced himself as Jerome Watkins, retired HVAC technician, 31 years with Train, HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. The systems that kept the greenhouse at 72 degrees and 65% humidity. The systems I maintained through knowledge and documentation, but which Jerome had spent 3 decades installing, repairing, and optimizing at a level I could not replicate. His skill set was irreplaceable. His body required approximately 2,400 calories per day. The greenhouse produced 2,200 per person for 8 people. We were 7. If I let 3 more people through that door, we became 10, and the math I'd built my entire system around no longer held. I looked at Jerome's hands, the calluses, the competence written into the skin itself. I opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in," I said. "Fast." They descended the stairs. I sealed the door behind them. The bolts engaged. The surface smell lingered in the stairwell for an hour before the air filtration system erased it. But I could still taste it. The sweet, wrong thing. It stayed on the back of my tongue like a warning I'd swallowed instead of heeded. The resource war. I ran the numbers that night while everyone slept. The laptop screen in Bay 4 cast a blue rectangle on the concrete wall, and I stared at the spreadsheet I'd maintained since the first seed sprouted, the one that tracked every variable in the greenhouse's caloric equation. The numbers were precise, and the precision was the problem. Bay 1, NFT hydroponic channels, produced approximately 4,800 calories per day in leafy greens. Lettuce, spinach, kale, chard, high in micronutrients, low in caloric density. A head of butterhead lettuce contains roughly 65 calories. You would need to eat 34 heads per day to sustain a single adult. Bay 2, deep water culture, produced approximately 7,200 calories in fruiting crops. Tomatoes, Peppers, cucumbers. Better caloric density, but still insufficient as a sole source. Bay 3, aeroponic towers produced approximately 5,600 calories in mixed crops, predominantly herbs, strawberries, and leafy greens that duplicated Bay 1's output at a smaller scale. Total daily production across all three growing bays, 17,600 calories. Divided by 7 people, 2,514 calories per person per day. Comfortable, sustainable, safe. Divided by 10 people, 1,760 calories per person per day. Survivable, technically, for a while. But 1,760 calories is a deficit diet. It's the number where bodies begin consuming themselves in small increments, burning muscle before fat, degrading cognitive function by week 3, compromising immune response by week 6. I designed this system for 8 people with a margin of error. 10 people eliminated the margin and started eating into the foundation. The solution existed in Bay 3. The aeroponic towers were producing strawberries and herbs that delivered flavor and micronutrients, but negligible caloric mass. A strawberry contains 4 calories. A sprig of basil contains less than 1. These were luxury crops, beautiful to grow, satisfying to eat, and calorically irrelevant in a closed system feeding 10 mouths. If I converted Bay 3 from low-calorie aeroponics to high-calorie tuber production, potatoes and sweet potatoes grown in perlite vermiculite grow bags under a modified light spectrum, the daily output would shift from 5,600 mixed calories to approximately 9,400 starch-dense calories. Total facility output would jump from 17,600 to 21,400 calories per day. Divided by 10, 2,140 per person. Not luxurious. Adequate. The distance between adequate and luxurious is where civilizations negotiate their priorities. The conversion required 72 hours. Dismantling the aeroponic towers, sterilizing Bay 3, installing grow bags, transplanting sweet potato slips from starter stock I'd maintained in a propagation tray since the testing phase, and adjusting the LED spectrum to include far-red wavelengths at 730 nanometers to trigger tuberization. During those 72 hours, Bay 3 would produce nothing. The caloric deficit would be covered by emergency rations from the storage wall. I told the group at the morning meeting. The response divided along lines I should have predicted. Maya understood immediately. David objected to the timeline because the ration bars tasted like compressed cardboard, and he wanted to know why we couldn't stagger the conversion to maintain partial production. I explained that partial conversion would extend the deficit period from 3 days to 9. He accepted the math, but not the taste. Elise said nothing during the discussion. She sat against the wall with her hands folded in her lap, watching the group dynamics the way I imagined she'd once watched field hospital triage, cataloging who functioned under resource pressure and who fractured. The fracture came on the second night of rations. David and Elise clashed over the watch schedule I'd implemented after the newcomers arrived. David argued that 2-hour shifts at the surface door were excessive when the door was bolted from inside. Elise argued that watch discipline was non-negotiable and that complacency killed more people than any external threat. The argument lasted 4 minutes and ended when Elise said, "If you've never stood a post, you don't get to have an opinion about standing one." David went quiet. The silence was worse than the argument. I worked through it. I transplanted sweet potato slips into grow bags at 2 a.m., while the voices and the quiet that followed them settled into the concrete walls. The rockwool cubes were cool and spongy under my fingers. The perlite mixture was light, almost weightless, a medium designed to hold nothing but air and water and roots. I placed each slip with the care of someone performing surgery on the future, because that's what it was. Each plant, if it rooted, would produce between 1 and 3 pounds of sweet potato in 90 days. Bay 3 converted in 68 hours. 4 hours ahead of schedule. The slips rooted. The LED spectrum shifted to include the far red band, and the grow bay glowed with a light that looked almost warm. The math worked again. For now, they learned to dig. The Ring doorbell camera I'd mounted above the greenhouse entrance was a $70 afterthought. I'd installed it during the testing phase to monitor weather conditions at the surface and to check the solar array's physical integrity after storms. It was designed to record package deliveries and neighborhood dogs. It was now the only visual link between 10 people living underground and whatever was happening above them. On day 31, at 2:43 a.m., the camera's motion sensor activated and sent an alert to the monitoring tablet I kept in Bay 4. I was awake because I was always awake at 2:43 a.m. Sleep had become a negotiation I consistently lost. I opened the feed and saw the first one. It came out of the tree line on the south slope, maybe 40 yards from the solar array. Through the camera's infrared mode, it was a gray shape against darker gray, moving with a gait I hadn't seen in the Norfolk footage or the emergency broadcast before the broadcast stopped. This wasn't the staggering, disorganized movement the early reports described. This was deliberate, purposeful. It walked to the nearest solar panel in the array and stopped. It placed both hands on the aluminum mounting frame and pulled. The panel shifted in its bracket. The mounting bolts, rated for 60-mile-per-hour wind loads, resisted. The figure pulled again. The bolts held. Then a second one emerged from the trees. It walked to the same panel. Same position. Same grip on the frame. They pulled together. The bolt sheared. The panel tilted 40 degrees off its mounting axis, and the power output monitor on my control board dipped. 1%. Then another arrived. I watched for 27 minutes. I counted 14 of them. Each one approached the array independently, but converged on the same panels. The ones closest to the electrical conduit that ran from the array down the slope and into the ground above the greenhouse entrance. They weren't attacking randomly. They weren't drawn by light or sound. The panels were dark, the array was passive at night, and I hadn't made a sound above ground in 31 days. They were following the conduit, tracing the path of electrical infrastructure through the ground the way a utility worker would trace a buried cable, following the electromagnetic signature of current flowing through copper wire. They were tracking the energy. Our energy, the power that kept the lights on, the water circulating, the nutrients dosing, the food growing. They had found the one thread that connected our sealed underground world to the surface, and they were pulling on it. By 3:20 a.m., 2 panels had been torn completely from their mounts. A third was bent at an angle that reduced its surface exposure by half. Total array output had dropped 15%. I ran the calculation before the fear finished forming. Below 70% output, the LED grow lights couldn't sustain the full-spectrum photosynthetic radiation required for fruiting crops. Below 50%, the climate control system would begin cycling off to conserve power, and the temperature in the greenhouse would start drifting toward the ambient underground temperature of 54 degrees. Below 30%, the water pumps would fail. The vibration came through the ceiling at 3:41 a.m., not through the camera feed, not through the speakers, through the concrete. A low shudder I felt in my jaw and in the roots of my back teeth, the physical sensation of something heavy being dragged across the surface directly above us. They were pulling a panel across the ground. I heard it through 12 inches of reinforced concrete and 30 feet of compacted clay. The sound was impossible and undeniable, a scraping that translated through solid earth the way whale songs translate through ocean, diminished but legible. Marcus appeared beside me. He'd felt it too. He looked at the camera feed. He looked at the power output reading. He looked at me. "We have to go up," I said. He nodded. I found Elise in the corridor outside the sleeping area. She was already dressed, already alert, already holding herself with the posture of someone who had been waiting for this conversation since the day she'd arrived. She looked at me and the question on my face, and she said 2 words. "How many?" I told her 14. She asked about weapons. I told her about the Remington, the Ruger, and an idea Jerome had described 3 days earlier involving the greenhouse's backup capacitor bank and 200 feet of copper wire. She almost smiled. "Almost. Let's go talk to Jerome," she said. The surface. Jerome drew the circuit diagram on the back of a seed inventory sheet with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear. His hand was steady. The lines were clean. 31 years of HVAC installation had given him a fluency with electrical schematics that David, who was a competent commercial electrician, acknowledged with a silence that meant respect. The concept was simple. The greenhouse's backup capacitor bank, a rack of 6 Maxwell ultracapacitors originally installed to buffer power fluctuations in the LED array during solar intermittency, stored approximately 2.4 kilowatt-hours of energy at 480 volts. Jerome proposed disconnecting the capacitor bank from the greenhouse circuit and routing its output through 200 feet of 12-gauge copper wire strung between the solar panel mounting posts, creating an electrified perimeter around the array. Anything that touched the wire would receive a discharge sufficient to cause immediate neuromuscular disruption. In a living human, that meant cardiac arrest. And whatever the infected were, we didn't know. But electricity doesn't negotiate with biology. Current flows. Tissue responds, or it doesn't. We went up at 3:47 a.m. Elise and I. She carried the Remington. I carried the capacitor bank in a military surplus duffel bag that Elise had brought with her, along with 200 feet of copper wire wound around a wooden spool that Marcus had found in the greenhouse's utility storage. The wire had been purchased for a drip irrigation expansion I'd never built. Now it was becoming a weapon. The things we buy for one purpose and use for another. The distance between a garden and a war measured in context. The steel door opened and the surface air entered my lungs like a language I'd forgotten. Smoke, pine resin, the mineral cold of mountainite. And beneath all of it, the chemical sweetness of mass biological decay that had settled into the Virginia hills the way fog settles into valleys, a permanent atmospheric layer composed of what used to be people. I breathed through my mouth and tasted it anyway. It clung to the soft palate like a residue. The solar array was 40 yards from the entrance, upslope on a south-facing grade. Through the darkness, I could see the damage. 2 panels lying flat on the ground, torn from their brackets. A third bent upward at an angle that looked like a broken limb. The mounting posts were intact. The conduit housing was scratched, but unbreached. The infected had pulled at the surface, but hadn't yet followed the wire underground. Yet, I worked fast. Elise stood perimeter with the Remington's barrel, tracking the tree line in slow arcs. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her breathing was controlled. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The measured respiratory pattern of someone managing their autonomic nervous system through training rather than will. I envied the discipline. My own hands were shaking as I strung wire between mounting posts, looping it at knee height around the array's perimeter, connecting each run back to the capacitor bank with alligator clips that Jerome had scavenged from the greenhouse's electrical maintenance kit. The wiring took 14 minutes. It should have taken 8. The darkness added time. The fear added more. When I connected the final lead to the capacitor bank's output terminal, the wire hummed. Not loudly. A vibration I felt through the alligator clip in my fingertips and up through my wrist. A tuning fork pressed against my sternum. The perimeter was live. We waited. The tree line was 200 yards south. I could see shapes at its edge through the Remington's optic, which Elise had handed me while she reloaded. Gray figures standing motionless between the trunks. Watching. They'd stopped approaching when we emerged. They were observing us the way I'd observed them through the ring camera. The symmetry was not comforting. One of them stepped forward. It crossed the open ground with that deliberate gait and reached for the nearest mounting post where the copper wire gleamed dully in the starlight. Contact. The capacitor discharged through the wire and into the figure's hand, and the body seized once, rigid, every muscle firing simultaneously, and dropped. It didn't get up. The others watched. They didn't advance. They stood in the tree line, and they watched their fallen, and I could see in the arrangement of their stillness something that terrified me more than the charge in the wire. They were learning what we'd done. I looked east while Elise covered the retreat. Past the ridge, past the dark canopy of the Hardware Valley, lights. Moving lights. A convoy on Route 29, heading south. Headlights in formation. Someone else was still organized. Someone else was still driving. 14 months. The convoy never came back. I watched for it on the Ring camera feed every night for 3 weeks, scanning the eastern horizon for formation headlights moving south on Route 29. Nothing. The road stayed dark. Whatever organization those lights represented, whatever remnant of structure was still driving vehicles in the Virginia night, it passed through the Hardware Valley once and kept going. I don't know where. I don't know who. I filed it alongside every other unanswered question that accumulates when the world ends and there's no one left to ask. The electrified perimeter held. Jerome redesigned the circuit twice in the first month, replacing the capacitor bank discharge system with a continuous low-amperage feed from the solar array itself, which meant the fence drew power during daylight hours and stored enough charge in a dedicated power wall to remain active through the night. The infected tested it 3 more times. Each time, one would approach, touch the wire, and fall. The others would watch. After the third incident, they stopped coming to the array. Whether they'd learned or simply moved on to easier targets, I couldn't determine. The result was the same. The panels stayed intact. The power stayed on. The greenhouse produced. That's the sentence that contains everything. While the surface world burned and starved and tore itself into unrecognizable configurations of what had once been civilization, 3,200 square feet of controlled environment agriculture 30 feet below Albemarle County, Virginia, did what it was designed to do. It grew food. Bay 1 cycled lettuce and greens every 28 days. Bay 2 fruited tomatoes and peppers on a continuous rotation that Patel optimized by staggering planting dates, so that something was always ripening. Bay 3, the converted potato bay, exceeded my projections by 17%. The sweet potatoes thrived under the far-red spectrum in ways that suggested underground conditions, stable temperature, no wind stress, no pest pressure, and uninterrupted light cycles might actually be superior to field cultivation for tuber crops. I documented this in my spreadsheet with the clinical detachment of an agricultural engineer performing research and the private wonder of a man watching the impossible become routine. 2,300 calories per person per day. 10 people. Indefinitely. The math held. The math held because I'd built the system to hold, and because Jerome kept the climate control at 72 degrees with replacement parts fabricated from materials we found in the storage bay and the utility closet, and once from a section of copper pipe Marcus cut from a drainage line we determined was redundant. Jerome worked the way Ruth organized her medical station, with the calm, systematic focus of a professional performing the function they were born for in the place that needed them most. He never complained about the converted bay, or the modified spectrum, or the fact that his daily caloric intake was adequate but not generous. He ate what the greenhouse provided and maintained the systems that made the providing possible, and the transaction was clean and self-sustaining, like the water cycle in the hydroponic channels. Patel's research continued. The underground signal persisted, 47-second intervals, unchanging for the first 4 months. Then, on day 127, the interval shifted. 48 seconds. On day 140, 49. On day 203, 53 seconds. The pulse was slowing. Patel mapped the deceleration curve and showed me the projection on the laptop screen one evening while the others ate dinner in Bay 1. If the pattern holds, he said, the signal will cease entirely in approximately 26 months. He didn't say what that meant. He didn't need to. A signal tied to the infection's replication cycle that was decelerating meant the infection itself was decelerating, weakening, burning out, or evolving into something we couldn't measure yet. Both interpretations were possible. Only one was hopeful. Lily grew strawberries. Maya let her adopt the one remaining aeroponic tower I'd kept from the Bay 3 conversion. A single vertical column producing fruit that contributed almost nothing to our caloric budget and everything to our psychological survival. Lily checked it every morning. She measured the berries with a ruler. She named the plants. She drew pictures of them in her sketchbook with colored pencils that were wearing down to stubs she sharpened with Ruth's surgical scalpel because no one could tell her not to. The strawberries were small and imperfect and grown in artificial light 30 feet underground, and they were the most important crop in the facility because a 9-year-old girl believed they mattered. She brought me one on the evening of the 14th month. She held it in her palm, red and warm from the LED lamps, and told me it was from the plant she'd named Grandma. I didn't ask why. I ate it standing beside the nutrient mixing station in Bay 1, where I'd eaten the first lettuce leaf 427 days ago. It was impossibly sweet, concentrated, as if every calorie the plant had produced had been compressed into this single fruit offered by a child who had never seen the sun touch a growing thing and didn't know what she was missing. I'm writing this at 3 a.m. Month 14. The water pumps are cycling. The LEDs are running their 18-hour photo period. In Bay 2, tomatoes are ripening in silence. In Bay 3, sweet potatoes are extending roots through perlite in the dark. Patel's signal monitor pulses every 54 seconds now. Slowing. Ruth is asleep. Jerome is asleep. Marcus is on watch at the surface door, listening for knocking that hasn't come in 7 weeks. Lily's strawberry plant is producing its 11th fruit. Above us, the world is ash. Below us, the world is green. I spent $1.4 million building an underground room where plants grow without sunlight and soil that doesn't exist, fed by water that recycles itself. Lit by energy that falls on panels, I nearly lost to creatures that used to be my neighbors. The world forgot how to feed itself. I didn't.